Let's begin by talking about how brain cells called neurons work. Neurons have specialized sites for receiving and sending information to and from neighboring cells. Neurons receive signals from neighboring cells from the tree-like projections found at the end of the cell called dendrites. Signals that come in through dendrites travel down the neuron and are sent off to other cells through the terminals. Neurons communicate to each other by releasing chemicals called neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are released when neurons undergo an electrical spike called an action potential. A neuron must have an action potential in order to send its information to its neighboring neurons. To get an action potential, the inside of the neuron needs to become more electrically positive than the outside. This happens when positively charged ions like sodium, potassium, or calcium move into the cell. Without this, our brain cells wouldn't be able to connect to each other or transmit signals like they do. Now that we understand how neurons themselves work, let's examine how drugs can affect them. Drugs act on circuits in the brain that are responsible for rewarding feelings. These rewarding feelings are caused by the release of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. For simplicity's sake, let's call the main components of these reward circuits as the blue group of neurons, which release a neurotransmitter called GABA. GABA's role is to reduce the activity of the pink group of neurons, which release dopamine, onto the orange group of neurons. So the effect of GABA is to reduce the rewarding sensation you feel because of the reduced amount of dopamine in the brain. The way that neurotransmitters like GABA and dopamine act is by binding to the proteins on the neurons called receptors. Alcohol molecules can hijack this process by also binding to these receptors. Drug consumption affects this reward circuit by causing the pink neurons to release more of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine is naturally occurring and normally released when you engage in helpful and life-sustaining activities. Drugs take advantage of this fact and increase dopamine levels, making drug consumption highly rewarding and even addictive. Alcohol affects your reward circuit through two main pathways. Alcohol can bind to neurotransmitter receptors called NMDA receptors. Normally, when a neurotransmitter binds to NMDA receptors, this allows positively charged ions to flow inside the cell. With ethanol bound to these receptors, this process is disrupted and less positively charged ions enter the cell. This prevents action potentials, which are essential for neuron-to-neuron communication. The end result? Neurons in the reward circuit where ethanol is bound will not be able to release GABA. Without GABA, we get too much dopamine, and with too much dopamine, we get addiction. The second pathway involves ethanol binding to receptors normally meant for GABA. When GABA normally binds to the GABA receptor, it allows negatively charged ions to enter the cell, which makes action potentials less likely. When ethanol is bound to GABA receptors, it actually allows more negative ions to enter the cell. By increasing the flow of the negatively charged ions into the cell, the result is that the neuron is unable to fire in an action potential and release dopamine. The end result is the same as the previous pathway. With fewer action potentials in the reward circuitry, we have fewer neurons blocking the release of dopamine. With alcohol, we therefore get too much dopamine, and with too much dopamine, we get addiction. If you would like to understand how these effects can be counteracted, watch our video on relapse and recovery.